Bitter Taste by Pure Voice Girl. Chapter 2. Tell me more about Hannibal Lecter, Will said, staring fixedly at the ceiling of Mathilda's boudoir, his hands stacked beneath his head. He was still hungry, but his plan had gone sideways. The woman he'd intended to devour had instead devoured him, inasmuch as she could manage. He might have been impressed that a woman of her age could have such appetites, but he'd learned long ago never to underestimate a woman, even if he'd been centuries old before she was born. "What would you like to know about him?" she asked, sitting at her vanity while she brushed her hair. She looked at him in the mirror, the soft light blending the fine lines on her skin, so that the woman within peeked out from the body time had given her. She was fresh from the shower, rosy and warm, and content to chat. She might, with the right incentive, even want him to stay the night. "Everything," Will said, rolling onto his side to look at her, knowing what a picture he made. He was very aware of himself in that way. Circumstance and necessity had required it. Always be elegant, always beguile, always pretend that the inside matched the outside. The illusion of innocence awaiting debauchement was a lure not many could resist, and Will was, if anything, a master fisherman. She stared at his mouth in the mirror, her own parting slightly. He closed his eyes slowly, deliberately fanning his lashes, giving her a moment to stare without allowing his impatience to show. Time had certainly done nothing to teach him patience. If anything, he keenly felt every second passed like days, the smallest of hesitations taking ages to rectify, until he felt he would go mad just waiting for the time it took the hands of the clock to move. "Well, I can't say I know much. He came to us some 5 years ago, I think. I believe he was somewhere in Europe before then, perhaps in his homeland." "Where's that?" Will asked, a different kind of hunger gripping him. He was hungry for details, ravenous to know about the man who was so tantalizingly unusual. He'd found something, finally, that was interesting. After all of this time, the suffocating blanket of boredom had peeled back, and he grasped for details with frenzied greed, desperate for relief from banality. "Lithuania," Mathilda said, her voice fairly dripping of scandal. "He used to be a medical doctor or one ilk or another, but now he practices psychiatry." Will mulled that one over, bringing Hannibal Lecter's face to mind with sharp clarity. His memory was as preternatural now as his existence was, storing every moment of his long life without issue or complaint, except for the night of his birth. That night was lost to him almost entirely, along with the details of his life before his transformation.
"Will you collude with me, Will?"
He smiled again and touched his mouth with surprise that it had happened twice without him meaning to. Prying secrets out of Baltimore's rich and famous. To be a fly on that wall. Mathilda's voice intruded on him, plucking the tight strings of his nerves so that he almost gave into the impulse to do just as he'd intended with her. After, he told himself, forcing down the hunger that sharpened with every moment. He could bear it. He tried abstinence before just to test it, just to see if he could manage without taking a life to fuel his own. He hadn't made that same mistake twice. After the party. Then I'll have something worth savoring on my plate. He's so elegant, don't you think? His home's just gorgeous. So cozy, but so avant-garde. He has an herb garden as a wall in his dining room. Can you imagine? Will tried, the darkness behind his eyes conjuring the vivid green of herbs growing one atop the other, climbing cracks in the wall like ivy. "It must smell wonderful," he breathed, and snatched reflexively at the small hand that fluttered onto his chest. His eyes flew open, and he immediately relaxed his hold, saying with tight, polite menace, "Sorry, you surprised me." Mathilda just stood there next to her bed, dark eyes wide with surprise. He offered her a different, shy smile, watching her from beneath the fringe of his lashes as she lost the sharp edge of almost fear he'd instilled in her. He flattened her hand to his chest over his heart, a gesture of reassurance, and breathed, "I'm back to bed." Her fingers curled slightly, nails lightly raking his skin. When she leaned down to kiss him, he didn't jump. And he kissed her and caressed her, playing the chords of her flesh with the skill of a maestro. All he could think was that he was bored and hungry. And as soon as the invitation for Dr. Lecter's dinner party arrived, he could finally well and truly make a meal of dear Mathilda. It came sooner than he thought it would. The next afternoon, in fact, hand-delivered in an elegant ivory envelope addressed in flowing, careful script. Will found the writing quite beautiful, if not a work of art in and of itself. "What is that, William?" Mathilda called, sweeping down the stairs on dangerously high heels, still fastening her understated but costly earrings. Will had a few pairs of those earrings himself, waiting in his pockets to be pawned. She paused at the foot of the stairs and slid the envelope out of his fingers with a long, appraising glance at him. "Dr. Lecter's invitation," he said, pretending she hadn't sent him one of her very own. Very few sensations could touch him keenly any more. Though his body performed as well now as it ever had in lusty youth, it was the inside of him that had detached somewhere along the way, drifting loose from the mundane details of prickling skin and passion. Mustering the energy to raise a performance time and again, especially as starving as he was rapidly leading him to a dangerous point. Mathilda might very well not survive her next indulgence in him. He wondered if she thought that would be a bad way to go or not. He wondered if her smile would finally unfreeze in horror, impaled by him in more ways than one. "Dr. Hannibal Lecter requests the pleasure of your company this coming Saturday, the 13th day of June," she read, her voice airy and young. "Well, we're to do some shopping, you and I." Will blinked, cocking his head slowly. "What?" "Darling, though I know I wouldn't complain if you went dressed only in those beautiful curls of yours and your pretty skin," Mathilda told him, a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "The rest of the party might not be so forgiving." He thought of the suit Dr. Lecter had been wearing, worth more than most people's homes, probably. "Hannibal," he reminded himself, and when he smiled again, Mathilda cupped his jaw and gave him a squeeze, saying, "There's a darling boy. Don't you worry, as long as I can undress you. I don't mind dressing you as well, William." "You're too kind," he said, and tipped his head to kiss her hand, and hopefully hide the bored disdain in his eyes. She did dress him. Rather, she had him dressed, fitted and pampered like a prize stallion on its way to auction. Nothing remained untouched, not his neatly trimmed curls, or his buffed fingernails, or even his toenails. And all he really wanted to do was eat her. He debated about it, lounging in her bath and inspecting his fingernails, which he surely hadn't seen so perfectly tended since he'd been groomed by his mother's maid for Christmas Mass. He thought about inviting her in here and asking her the questions he'd asked all of them, his long, long string of victims. "What do you want most in this world? Name me that thing." He had money now, thanks to the small things from her home he'd pawned over the past week. He didn't actually need her any more. But she knew him, Hannibal Lecter. She knew him well enough to be invited to his home, with himself as an add-on. If his plans went south and he failed this evening, he would need to make use of dear Mathilda again in the future to gain repeat access. "It might be a long stay this time," he thought, sinking into the water up to his forehead. It rankled him, but the moment he'd seen Hannibal Lecter, he'd abruptly shifted his goal. Before he left Baltimore this time, he'd sink his teeth into Hannibal Lecter and see if he tasted just as interesting as he seemed. A steady thump drew nearer, the noise reverberating through the water. Small feet shod in large heels, tip-tapping their way closer, with the same clicking rhythm of deer hooves on ice. He rose from the bath in one slow, graceful movement, water pouring down his skin like the trails of a lover's tongue. He fastened his gaze on Mathilda, who had paused in her tracks, her intent forgotten, eyes wide. It was almost too easy sometimes, as if desire was the very least of the things that could be inspired in a human heart. But it wasn't as if he could long for or remember more. Love was the brushing recollection of his mother's arms around him. Happiness was the fading peals of laughter from his sister's mouth. Once upon a time he'd felt everything far too well, far too potently, to the point that it had almost driven him mad. Now all he could feel was anticipation in the face of conquest and the thrill of hunting his prey. "I came to see if you were ready," she finally said, a little breathlessly, two hectic spots of color blooming on her cheeks. "Oh, yes," he told her, and something in his gaze made her take a step back when he slid out of the tub with practiced elegance. "I certainly am."